WOLFMAN CHARLES by Nick Madison. Hey now, baby, did you get that letter? You take me back, and I'll treat you better. Ain't no one's business but my own. The Devil Makes 3, 2001. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Genesis chapter 49, verse 27. Chapter 1. If you were to ask the folks on the street what they knew about Wolfman Charles, they'd give you a treasure trove of different legends. They'd tell you he's been known to rip through a bottle of Gentleman Jack faster than he does through a villager's rib cage. They tell you he's got the moon in his eyes, just like the witchy woman from that Eagles song. They tell you his body hair gives off the same musk as the devil's cologne. No matter the puzzle piece you get from each individual, they all come together to form the overall picture. Even if not for the whole lycanthropy thing, Wolfman Charles is a man whom you'd surely regret to cross. I met Charles under the most dire of circumstances. The day before, I had a smartphone and a backpack with a laptop in it. One lousy night and 2 cunning dope fiends later, I had nothing but my resilience and a pack of spirits. Stranded in South Salt Lake, there's little for fresh meat to do but pray for a rescuer to pull up in a rusty old Ford pickup. Need a lift? I could tell right away the man was out to stir up trouble of some kind or another. His smile showcased his stained, crooked teeth, long canines resembling dog fangs. His eyes cut through the night, indicating a friendly attitude with their liveliness, but also a sense of detachment, maybe from close encounters with the ugly and depraved. Most noticeable was his unkempt appearance. His facial hair, being a probably Scotch-Irish red, was far from a well-groomed beard of wisdom. It grew like seedling grass from the sides of his jaws, thickening at the chin to resemble forest moss. Based on the last time a man gave me a lift in this part of town, I was decidedly weary of free rides. So, you want to let me suck you off and I'll give you $100? No, I'm okay. Really? Yeah, I'm okay. Come on. It's not happening. 200? Nope, I'm okay. Come on. Luckily, that guy was a good sport about my refusal. I knew that I may not be so lucky the next time. This cat seemed different, though. Well, cat wouldn't quite be the right choice of words, but I'd figure that out soon enough. I replied, "Yeah, man, that would actually be great." "Well," he said, "hop in then." I jumped up and strode around to the passenger side. The door handle was one of those old-fashioned push-the-button-and-pull types. I climbed in and tried shutting the door, but something kept it from closing. "The door's fucked up," he said. "You gotta lift up on it." I lifted up on it. Still no success. He chuckled. "You really gotta lift up on it." After 3 or 4 more tries, it closed. "Now pull it shut." I gave it a tug. It clicked. "There you go." I introduced myself. "My name's Nicholas," I chirped, sticking my hand out. "Charles," he said, obliging the shake. "Pleasure to meet you." "Likewise. Thanks for the lift, man. You're really saving my ass right now." "It's all good. Just pay it forward. Where are you headed?" "Honestly, I have zero idea." Charles grinned. There went those teeth again. I kinda figured. I rolled my eyes. "Yeah, you're right." He was right. Muddy boots, camo pants, grubby jacket, faded scarf, and a black beanie, a miserable sight. His dress wasn't too different, a beanie and boots of his own with a less than flashy coat, but somehow he just seemed better prepared. Clothes more freshly washed, maybe, coat a little heftier than mine, perhaps, but I think what it was sat more in the realm of his demeanor. Something about it was, how do I put it, experienced. Like he would know what he was doing no matter what may come up. "So, tell me," he said, "how'd you end up here?" "Well, I was supposed to just be passing through," I replied, "but my car shit on me and I ran out of money, so I've kinda just been stuck here." "How long?" "Oh, a few weeks probably." "Damn, dude, that fucking blows." "Oh, most definitely. It's the first time I've been robbed, too." "I've been robbed a couple times before." "Is that right?" "Yeah, but see, I always get my shit back." "How's that?" "Well," he said, "this helps." With his left hand, Charles produced the biggest, scariest knife I'd ever seen from somewhere under the seat. "Well," I said, nonchalantly as possible, "I imagine it would." "The jugular's good," said Charles, "but the chest is good, too." Noted. That conversation was followed by an awkward pause. "Could you pass me a cigarette from that pack right there?" He pointed to the Marlboros on top of the dash. "Yeah, sure." I passed one. "Want one?" "Nah, I got some spirits on me." "Bust one out then." I busted one out. Cheers, said Charles, extending his to mine. Cheers. We clinked cigarettes. Got a light? Nah, a Bud Light. I whipped out my Zippo and sparked him up like a Tarantino movie, then lit my own. Snow began to fall. I huffed a sigh. I haven't always hated snow, nor do I remember when I began to, but I will say this. As a child, your parents bundle you up like first-class mail and take you back inside after a short while to give you hot cocoa. Normally you stay dry, and Mommy's usually on the lookout for any sign of wetness so she can change you into something nice and fresh. When you've left the nest in eastern Washington and you're stranded in South Salt Lake, this is not the case. I thought about the soggy socks on my feet and huffed another sigh. What's up, man? Oh, nothing. I shook my head, a bit surprised that he picked up on my agitation so easily. Just thinking about all that snow. Oh, yeah, snow's always a bitch. Honestly, I don't see why people would want to live in it. It's not so bad when you're prepared. I take it you're always prepared then? Well, he paused, tilting his head. Some nights more than others, I'll put it that way. Sounds about right. His phone turned on with a notification. 3 days until next full moon. He swiped it away. So, your car, he said. What's good with that? I sighed. Well, in short, it shit on me and I ran out of money to fix it. It's sitting in a mechanic shop and I just have to hustle up some money so I can get back on the road. Where are you headed off to then? Colorado Springs, where the milk and honey flows. What for? I sighed once more, answering this question for the 100th time. Sales job. I don't really want to talk about it. Why's that? Well, it's just that I've given the whole spiel of what my job is to so many different people out here, and frankly, I'm just fucking tired and miserable right now. I hope you understand. Fair enough. I just think that if you were so gung-ho about this job, you'd be happy to talk about it. Well, the thing is, it's not really my dream job or anything. I'm just trying to build a skill so I don't have to go to college. What I want is to be a full-time writer. Charles lit up. A writer, huh? What kind of writer? Well, fiction, first and foremost, I said. But also journalism if something good happens to come up. Charles nodded, scrunching his face as if to say, all right, I can respect that. He took a good long drag and said, I think I can give you a good story. I was excited when he said that, but not surprised, probably because I was already half expecting him to say it. I played it cool and took a long drag of my own. That could be arranged, I said. What kind of story can you give me? Let's just say it's still in the making, said Charles. But if you want to stick with me for a while, you'll end up with something worth your time. He laughed, once more showing off those dog teeth. That I can guarantee. I flicked the butt out the window and shrugged. Fuck it, I said. I've got nothing better to do. And that, boys and girls, is where our story begins. Chapter 2. We sat by a fire in the woods on a mountainside, savoring every bit of warmth it gave off into the Utah cold. The snow was light, but it was still cold enough to make your digits fall off. Over our heads was a lean-to shelter made of sticks, branches, and leaves. The shelter was my idea, and when I first suggested it, I made sure to mention that I'd learned how it was done in the Scouts, and that I, being an Eagle, knew a decent bit about that sort of thing. Charles seemed to have respect for that. He even seemed a little impressed, which is what I was after. All the sales gurus like to stress the importance of making clear any kind of value that you could provide to the prospect. Charles was a prospect, and as a writing subject only secondarily. Primarily, his importance to me was the hope of getting the hell out of Utah. I knew I'd be damned to let him think of me as a burden, and for other reasons, I kept in mind, I knew I'd also be damned to piss him off. I kept quiet. The fire had just gotten going not too long ago. It was finally burning the fuel, that is, the big logs, after the great fiasco of trying to light up the wet kindling. We sat and smoked. Charles got up. What's going on? I asked. Oh, nothing, he said. Just gotta grab something from the truck. The truck was parked about 100 feet off, far enough from the fire's light that I couldn't very well see it. I panicked. What was he getting from it? That knife? We were pretty far up the mountain and pretty far from town. It was dark, cold, and I didn't know the area. If Charles was about to come back and hurt me, I had slim chances of escaping with my neck intact. The truck door slammed shut. Charles began to walk back. I sucked in the rest of my cigarette and threw the butt into the fire. Now was the moment of truth. Charles stepped into the light. No knife in his hand, just a bottle. I sighed a quiet breath of relief. Jack Daniels? I asked. Old number 7, said Charles, with his dog smile. Most of it's still in here, too. He shook the bottle to prove that it was indeed still about 3/4 full. The night turned out to be a quaint one. The whiskey working together with the fire made us forget the cold even existed. Well, me at least. I suspected Charles had something of an edge with all that extra hair. Either way, the objective now was to drink and be merry, and we were well on the way to surpassing it, especially Charles. If I was to be called a lightweight, which would be an understatement, Charles would be called a belt-holding heavyweight champion. Luckily, he didn't hold my lack of tolerance against me, nor did he push me past my limits. More for me was all he said, and soon the bottle was almost gone. Charles showed no intention to slow down and likely would have licked the bottle clean had we not been interrupted. Footsteps came crunching down the mountain. Amidst my immediate terror, I made a small observation. Someone coming up the hill would have been normal, but who on earth would be coming down the hill at this hour? I tried to squint in the direction of the noise, but it was too dark to see. I looked over at Charles, who, for some odd reason, seemed to just be sniffing the air rather than trying to spot a silhouette. "What do you think that is?" I whispered. "Hard to say," said Charles. "Hopefully not cops." Suddenly, as the footsteps neared, a voice came to accompany them. The voice, presumably female, was ranting angrily about something or someone. "You motherfuckers think you could do me like this?" Damn, she was really pissed. "I'm with the Cherokee tribe and I know the ways of the shaman." That was about all I could clearly make out. The rest of her words were slurred and drowned out by intervals of growls and roars. "Well," said Charles, "now we know it isn't cops." The lady must have heard us, because the next intelligible sentence she uttered was, "Ooh, who's having a fire down there?" I looked at Charles for ideas on what to do next. He was barely fazed. He rose to his feet, holding up his index finger as if to say uno momento, and half jogged to the truck again. While he was gone, our visitor finally stepped into the edge of the light. Though her figure was dimly lit, it was easy enough to see that she was just a little old lady, no taller than 5'4", and a little too white to be a Cherokee. Under her little black hat, dress, and jacket, the firelight reflected off her hair, giving the twigs and chunks of sticky black goo in it more visibility. She stopped when she got within shouting distance and asked, "Can one of you nice young men help a lady out? Let her bum a pair of shoes." "No," said Charles, moving from behind me to the fire. The woman seemed not to notice him say anything. She staggered toward us, carrying on about her shoes that she lost in her sleep and about her high standing in the Cherokee shaman community, from whom she'd learned hexes to curse people and their grandchildren's children for the next 6 generations. Charles nudged me, motioning for me to look down at the tire iron half hidden under his leg. He grinned and whispered to me, "Don't worry, it's probably not the first time she's woken up in a strange place." I shrugged. Hard to argue with that. The woman was close enough to see clearly now. She looked like a regular old lady, except that her eyes were a little wider and more sunken than the average bear. "Do you know who I am?" "No, ma'am," I replied. I noticed, as she talked, that she also had a few less teeth than the average bear. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Again she asked the question, leaning in closer. That way we could get a better look at her gigantic, exposed eyeballs. "No," sighed Charles. "We don't know who you are." She shouted, pounding her chest with each syllable of the answer. "I am Mama D!" I glanced over at Charles, seeming both amused and frustrated, probably more so the latter. Had I not been watching, I may not have noticed the very subtle but very deep breath he took before he said, "Nice to meet you, Mama D." "At your service." She bowed with a flare and staggered towards me, then around to Charles, asking how our night was going and commenting on our nice warm fire right before settling down next to it. "You boys wouldn't happen to have another pair of shoes, would you?" Apparently she'd already forgotten. Again we told her no, the ones on our feet were all we had. She kept on babbling. "I've been walking 7 days without a thing but these bandages on my feet," she crooned. "See 'em?" "Yes, we can see them," said Charles, referring to the white gauze that was mummy-wrapped around Mama D's feet and ankles. "And I'm sorry about your situation, but we can't help you right now." Mama D slumped her shoulders and stuck out her bottom lip. "Well, all right," she sighed. "I suppose it's all just as well." I took pity on her. "Want a cigarette? I got spirits." "I would love one," she cried. I started to pull one out of the box, and she fell to her hands and knees, crawling to my feet so she could beg like a dog before she stood up. You sure got a lot of energy for somebody your age, I said, handing her the cigarette. She paused. Suddenly, her eyes were angry. They changed with no effort, widening even more and sinking just a little ways back into her skull. Something told me that Mama D wasn't the only one living inside that noggin of hers. Somebody my age? Her pirate teeth helped to accentuate her snarl. What exactly are you trying to imply, Mr. Man? I looked right back into those eyes and smirked, remembering the tire iron in Charles's hand. Well, I said, your hair's gray and you're dressed up like the Queen of England, so I wouldn't imply that you're young. Just then, the expression on her face made a grasshopper quick jump from hellfire back to sunshine. She laughed and she said she was just playing, patting me on the shoulder. She told me I was a fine young man with a great sense of humor and that she was very proud of me. She stretched out her arms for a hug. At first I hesitated, then thought, fuck it, I'll risk getting ticks and lice. And I hugged her back like she was my grandmother. She also hugged me like she was my grandmother, then took it one step further when she grabbed my shoulders and said, You know, you look a lot like my great-great-great-grandson from the future. I said, shit, maybe I am. She held her chin and furrowed her brow. Yeah, maybe you are him, she said. But they wiped your memory so you can't remember your mission. Pardon me, I'm not sure if I asked already, but how old are you, hun? 19, I said. My birthday was in September. Oh, goodness, you're just a little baby boy. That means you were born in what year now? 2000. 2000? Her eyes lit up in awe, revealing all the veins. Y2K! She held up her palm and I high-fived her. All the while, Charles watched us quietly. By now, he'd sat back down by the fire, using the tire iron to tend the wood. His first attempt to make conversation was asking, When were you born? Mama D tapped her chest with both hands. You talking to me, homeboy? Yes, I am, said Charles. I'm curious, when were you born? You don't mind me asking, do you? Mama D turned her attention from me and took one creeping step toward Charles, craning her neck and tilting her head to one side. I was born when Hancock and Jefferson signed the Declaration, she hissed, about 250 years ago. I stepped to the side so I could see both of their faces. Mama D looked like a crouching Black Panther, but still holding her unlit cigarette. Charles sat calmly with a friendly but still canine smile. Is that right? He asked. Young man, I'm the last real witch doctor out here. She stood up straight and put her hands on her hips. They know me on the streets, and they'll tell you I don't bullshit around. You can bet your boots on that one, homie. Well, I don't know if it'd be good to bet his boots, I said. Looks like you already did. She whipped her body back to face me again, apparently back in angry mode, baring her teeth. You're something of a regular smartass, aren't you? Think so? I finally lit up my own cigarette. Don't lie, she said. You know it very well. I said, yeah, then paused, taking a drag, speaking again into a cloud of smoke. But I'm the smartass who just gave you a stogue, and judging by how long you've been standing there just holding it, I'm going to venture to guess that you need me to light it, too. He's got a point, said Charles. Mama D switched back to happy mode. Oh, yes, of course, she chuckled, patting my shoulder again. You know I didn't mean it like that. It's all good. I'm your triple great-grandson from the future, right? Right. She touched my shoulder once more, rubbing it affectionately. I tried to light her up with my Zippo, but was curbed by a sudden gust of wind. Try again, said Mama D. Use your mind. I sparked up the Zippo. When another gust blew through, I tried to hold up my hand to block it, but Mama D shrunk back and said, No, use your mind. On try number 3, I managed to light the cigarette with no guarding hand, apparently just my mind, and we both cheered while Charles just snickered. Even though she'd obviously been smoking something harder than tobacco and was probably possessed by at least a couple of evil spirits, Cherokee or otherwise, I was having a lot of fun with this old woman who lived in the woods or the streets or whatever. When the excitement died down, we joined Charles by the fire, forming a triangle, each one of us facing the other two. A nice little silence ensued. Charles fed the fire so it burned bright again, then asked another question. So, how come they call you Mama D? He flicked the cigarette butt into the fire, then folded his hands over the tire iron like an old man's cane, leaning forward to hear the answer. There was no wrath for this question. She giggled and said, Oh, yeah, that. It's just 'cause my name's really Darcy. She punctuated her reply with harsh cackling, looking from Charles to me to see if we were laughing along with her. We weren't. All she got was polite nodding with raised eyebrows. She regained composure, took a drag, and continued to speak. These woods, now I tell you. She took another drag, rolling her eyes as she exhaled, preparing to speak the brutal truth. These woods have just been terrible on my poor little feet. Just terrible. Just look. She began to unwrap one of the bandages. I think we're okay, said Charles. You don't have to show us. It was no use. Darcy kept on going. I was so anxious to see how bad the damage really was that I forgot to protest. Charles tried, but he knew he couldn't stop her. It wasn't like he could forcibly prevent her from removing the bandages. What was he going to do? Use his hands? All things considered, at least I wasn't disappointed. The damage was pretty bad. The sole of Darcy's foot was decorated with 3 big circles, like juicy red-violet volcanoes, full of diseased human pus crying out in want of eruption. It was a wonder she'd been getting by with just those bandages, honestly. I said, "Damn, dude, that sucks." She turned to show Charles. That is pretty terrible, said Charles. Isn't it, though? That's why I stopped by here, said Darcy. That way I could see if a couple of nice young men could help me out with a pair of shoes. Well, like we said earlier, said Charles, speaking like a scolding kindergarten teacher, we don't have any shoes for you, and if you're having those kinds of problems, you really shouldn't be out walking in the woods anyways. Oh, but you don't understand, hon. I have to stay in the woods or the trees won't know what to do. I retorted, Since when do trees not know what to do? All they do is stand there. No, you don't understand. Darcy spoke with the heart of a dead poet. The trees need me. I'm their queen. I have to command them. She turned to Charles. You know this to be true, she told him. When he shook his head and told her no, he didn't, she held her dusty, blackening hands at the sides of her face, sounding on the verge of tears. You do, she cried. You both know it to be true. The animals go off my vibes. You know this. Charles was beginning to lose his patience, but still made an effort to stay calm. No, he said. I'm going to tell you right now the animals do not go off your vibes. Darcy stamped her foot. Well, how would you know a thing like that? The burners flickered on for the angry eyes again. She spoke through clenched teeth. How in the hell would you know a thing like that unless you yourself were... She stopped and regained composure once more. She smiled, but not like before when she was trying to be friendly. The smile was sort of smug, saying something like, checkmate. She took a drag and pointed her cigarette at Charles's face. That's right, she whispered. I thought I knew you from somewhere. She glanced up at the sky and looked back down at him. You're just head over heels for that thing, ain't you? Charles no longer smiled. I butted in. Head over heels for what? When Darcy heard this, her jaw dropped. You mean you don't know? Darcy turned from Charles and started towards me, close enough that I could smell her decaying breath. The moon, sweetie. Your friend here, he holds that moon very close to his heart. They all do. I crossed my arms. Well, that would explain the moon tracking app on his phone. There you go. She nodded her head up and down, fast and hard enough to give herself a splitter. Yes, that's right, young man, she went on. I know his name, too. She turned away from us and covered her eyes. Now what was it? Chuck? Chaz? Charlie? Charles leapt up and smacked a home run into the back of Darcy's head with the tire iron. With a sharp clink, she flew forward and ate shit on the dirt. I stood in shock for a moment, only snapping out of it when I noticed Charles going through her pockets. I lit another cigarette and waited for him to finish. He resurfaced with a wad of cash in his hand. $63, he reported. Well, I'll be damned, I said. What was she doing begging for shoes? Could be any number of things. Charles picked up the Jack bottle from behind where he'd been sitting, out of Darcy's view. She might owe it to someone. She might have been saving it for a phone or something. He paused to take another swig, then handed the bottle off to me, then I took a swig. It reminded me that I was already just a little over the edge. But most likely scenario is, Charles continued, she'd just gotten hold of it somehow, and hey, $60 can get you a lot of meth. He reached for the bottle. I held up one finger as if to say uno momento, and took one more sip before handing it back. Serves her right, I said. She probably stole it anyways. Right, but when she wakes up. If she wakes up, I interjected. You whomped her pretty good, man. Charles grinned. If she wakes up. She'll have a dry fire pit, still with hot coals probably. Not only that, he passed the bottle back, but she'll also have a lean-to shelter, handcrafted by the hand of a real-life Eagle Scout. I nearly choked on my liquor. Amen to that. In that case, where are we going? Charles turned for the truck and I followed. I noticed his drunken swagger, but I dared not make fun. After all, I was probably walking the same way on a lot less. Well, Charles said to me from behind him, $60 may be a lot of meth, but it's even more in gas. I say we grab something to eat and get the fuck out of here. I raised the bottle in the air. Amen to that as well, I declared, then took another sip, spilling whiskey on my chin. Chapter 3. By the time we reached the nearest gas station, we were out of cigarettes, so about a third of Darcy's money went toward a pack of Marlboros and a pack of spirits. Charles went in to pay for everything. I went in to take a shit. By the acidity of my shit, I could tell that I'd had more liquor than I was used to. At least I'm doing it here, I mused. Better than having a fucking emergency in the middle of a busy highway. I thought of the car I needed to fix and the sales job I was supposed to get to. As I pulled my pants up and headed to the sink, I began to worry, but then I remembered what my boss-to-be had told me over a text message. Nah, it's all good. Your opportunity isn't going anywhere, man. Take as much time as you need. I thought back to the book that he'd recommended to me, one by the late great Dale Carnegie, one of the great gods in the sales pantheon, along with Napoleon Hill and Zig Ziglar, in which he spoke of the old saying about, "Give us this day our daily bread." In short, he asserted that we ought not worry about tomorrow or next week so much as today. Is my belly full? Is my neck intact? And so on. I decided to be a good salesman and say fuck it. And say fuck it I did, with both my lips and my heart, while I was washing my hands right into the mirror. I blew-dried my hands and burst out the door with clean bowels and a cocky attitude. When I got outside, the truck was parked in front of the store instead of by the pump. Charles already had a cigarette going. Soon I was sitting next to him, waking up the cancer. So where to now, Chief? I lit up and cracked the windshield. North, said Charles, to see my OG. OG? Yeah, I was initiated into, well, something. All I'm saying right now is I got the marks to prove it. And I take it by marks you don't mean grades? Charles grinned. Very funny. No, they're marks on my body. Tattoos? No, but I do have a few of those as well. When do I get to see these marks then? I need to know, of course, as your biographer. Soon. Right now, though, we're going to find something to eat. Did you save enough money for that? No. The plan isn't to buy food. So we're stealing from Winco then? No, we're going to stop and camp in the woods again. I'll catch something. How do you know you're going to catch something? Charles glanced at me, grinning again. I find your lack of faith disturbing, he said, flicking his cigarette butt and rolling up the windshield. Something you're going to learn pretty soon, Nicholas, is that when you're around me, food is no object. This raised a myriad of questions, but I decided not to ask any just yet. Instead, I just said, well, alrighty then, and just sat quietly for a while. Charles turned on the radio, and we listened to the local new country station at the volume of a Vietnam firefight. Not my first choice, but at least it wasn't One Direction. When I spoke up again, it was to ask for the time. Charles checked his phone, showing that it was currently around 3 a.m. A new notification appeared, announcing that the full moon was now only 2 days away. I seized the opportunity. So what exactly is the whole deal with the moon? I shouted over the music. Charles sighed. Here, he said, holding up his right hand for me to look at. You see this? The palm of your hand? Yeah, you see what it looks like, right? Like the palm of your hand? Exactly, nothing too peculiar, right? As far as I can tell. Good. Just remember that, and it'll all start coming together for you real soon. With that, I shrugged, once again saying, well, alrighty then, and we continued on with the radio still blasting. Tuning out the trucks, beer, and bitches and cut-off jeans lyrics, I racked my brain as to what the deal was with this guy. I mean, really. I had no idea what he wanted to prove with the palm of his hand, but other than that, every sign was pointing to werewolfism of some kind or another. I wondered if maybe he was in a cult, or maybe just some weird-ass role-playing club. I was tolerating his being so cryptic because I figured he'd at least have some kind of surprise for me later on, and, like I said before, fuck it, I had nothing better to do. Of course, it did cross my mind that I might have been in danger. Maybe Charles was just a deranged cannibal and he was waiting for the full moon to murder and eat me, then, who knows, maybe molest my corpse while he howled at the moon. Thinking about it, it was honestly kind of surprising that I hadn't met someone like that in Salt Lake already. It definitely crossed my mind, but it also crossed my mind that I wasn't a hot chick, and unlike the last guy who gave me a ride, he seemed pretty straight to me. By the time I thought about pulling out another cigarette, Charles was already pulling over the truck and turning the radio down to silent. I knew better than to ask, so I just wondered to myself what it was this time. The location didn't look like anything special, just more uphill highway, a fence at the top of a steep slope on one side and some ominous-looking woods on the other side. "Something's here," Charles whispered. I lit up another. "Something bad?" "No, but we do need to be careful before it realizes we're here." Charles shut off the truck. He told me to sit tight and took his coat off, stepping out into the freezing air with just a white t-shirt. At first I thought, goodness gracious, what a madman. But then it occurred to me that, to be fair, there was quite a bit of body hair on him. Mind on the subject, I noticed something else. Since we'd left the gas station earlier, I could almost swear that the man was even hairier than before. More on the arms, more on the head, more on the face. It didn't quite cross over into animal territory, but for a human, it just seemed a hair too shaggy. I decided not to comment on it out loud. I figured that whatever was about to happen next would be a lot weirder than that, and I was right. Charles, with a "be right back," ran straight into the woods. I knew there was nothing I could do but wait it out, whatever it was, so I sat in the truck and puffed on my cigarette, hoping that whatever he was looking for wasn't about to find me first. I had plenty to stew over while I sat there, none of it including a car or a sales job. I wasn't horribly frightened, but I was just a little anxious about this guy I was riding around with, him being the only one with any idea where the hell we were going besides north to see my OG. Who was this OG of his, anyway? Lon Chaney Jr.? And what was the deal with the palm of his hand? Most of all, where did all that fucking hair come from? My brain just about overheated trying to find an explanation for hair growth that fast, anything but the obvious. Having made friends with an actual werewolf would have topped the delusions of even the furthest gone meth heads in Salt Lake. Except for Darcy, maybe. And on that subject, how did that Darcy woman know about Charles's thing with the moon? What else did she know? Probably a lot, I figured. The animals went off her vibes after all. As I was finishing my smoke, a sound snapped me out of my train of thought. The sound, bursting out of the woods, was the frantic clomping of hooves on the dirt. A buck, small but decidedly full-grown judging by the antlers, was trotting out of the shadowy trees with about 100 feet to the road. I thought, well, this is exciting. It reminded me of a scout trip from my pubescent days when a baby bear ran across the hiking path, followed by its mother a few seconds later. The difference here, though, was that the way the bears were running was rather casual. I dare even say carefree. Though I could barely see this deer when I first noticed it coming, it was obvious right away that there was nothing casual or carefree about the way he ran. As he got a little closer, I caught a glimpse of the creature trailing behind the buck. The creature, of course, was Charles. Now, I'm not by any means an expert on Utah wildlife, but I'm pretty sure the average deer can run something like 45 miles an hour when he's really booking it. With this in mind, imagine one being gained on by a human being, and that is what I was witnessing from a front row seat in the truck. Finally, the deer got to the road. At this point, Charles was less than 5 feet behind him. His hooves were much louder on the road than on the dirt, but I didn't get to hear that sound for much longer than a second before he made the jump over the roadside fence. As fast as Charles was going, I couldn't imagine him catching the thing on a slope as long and steep as that one. It turned out I didn't need to, though, because when the buck jumped, Charles jumped with him. Like I said earlier, the deer wasn't awfully big, but I'm sure it weighed quite a bit more than Charles. This, however, didn't by any means stop him from catching the deer by the hind leg and yanking him downwards. The deer, having made it halfway over the fence before he was caught, came down easy as a rag doll, slamming onto the metal frame in his midsection with a loud clang and a shrill squeal from his mouth. What happened next took about 30 seconds. Charles grabbed the buck by his antler with both hands and threw it onto the road. He squealed some more and made a vain attempt to scramble to his feet before Charles threw an arm around his neck. His last breaths were spent crying out and struggling while Charles held on and ducked from the antlers, pulling the same knife he'd shown me before from a leather sheath I didn't even know he had. I could tell the buck's death was quick by how quickly he stopped struggling after Charles sliced his neck open. What wasn't so quick was the waterfall of blood afterwards, which Charles allowed to spill right onto the road, directly in my view. Some folks wouldn't be able to stomach such a sight, but lucky for me, I have a pretty strong stomach when it comes to blood and guts. That, and I wouldn't receive a very high score from PETA either. When I was about 4 years old, I remember my father telling me that the dead doe in the back of his pickup was Bambi's mother. I also remember believing him and not feeling even a little sorry for her, or Bambi himself for that matter. I felt even less sorry a few days later when I got to taste my first venison. I've been a fan ever since, so dinner on this night was a treat. Once the waterfall was over, Charles slung his prey over his shoulders and ventured into the woods. I followed, carrying his coat and the whiskey bottle. Few words were spoken between us as we descended into those woods. It was mostly just commentary on the snow that was beginning to fall, and how it was about time, since the state of Utah was usually buried in it by now. I built the fire and another lean-to while Charles did a hasty job of dressing the deer with his knife. Soon, we were back to the way we were before we met the great and powerful Mama D, but this time with a dead buck laying beside us while we roasted bits of its neck, kebab style. He went well with the jack. We discussed venison and different ways of serving it. I told the story of Bambi's mother in the back of my dad's truck. And I was like, shit, I don't care, I'll tell Bambi right to his sobbing little face, I said. I'll be like, your mother can't be with you anymore, but god damn she was good in that chili. Charles held the bottle away from his lips so he could laugh without spilling. All in all, we had a great time that night. Drunken laughter and cigarette smoke filled the air long after the fire smoke had dissipated. The snow turned out to be brief, and when we noticed it had stopped, we discussed the lack of it in recent times, whether global warming was real, and whether man played a hand in it if it was. I told him I didn't like snow anyway, so who gives a damn? Run those Hummers, I say. He said he didn't mind snow so much, to which I retorted by pointing out the ungodly amount of hair he had to protect him, being careful not to mention how much it had already grown in the last few hours. Through all this talk, not once did we speak a single word about the way he'd killed the buck. Neither did we speak of tomorrow's plans, where we were going, his OG, the palm of his hand, how he knew that there was a deer in the woods all the way from his moving truck, and least of all did we speak of the moon, currently in its waxing gibbous phase and ready to pass out of it. What we did do was glance up at it every now and then, both of us knowing that the other was thinking about it. Chapter 4. Some folks are woken up by alarm clocks, some by roosters, and some by squalling babies. Me? I was woken up that morning by loud slurping and chewing sounds coupled with grunts and heavy breathing. As soon as I gained full consciousness and realized what I was hearing, I sprung up to see what it was. It was light out and probably midday, which made sense considering the obscene hour at which I'd finally fallen asleep. Clearly, Charles didn't require as much rest as me, because the dead buck was split wide open now and almost completely hollowed out, not because he'd finished dressing it, but because he'd been using bare hands to shovel large chunks of its raw flesh and guts into his mouth all morning. Actually, correction. His hands weren't bare anymore. They were now covered with thick layers of hair on the backs of them, and wielding long, pointed fingernails. The hair on the rest of his body was considerably furrier now, too. The only thing still recognizable was his face, aside from all the deer blood and teeth that were now twice as big as last night. I jumped about 15 feet. What the fuck, dude? Despite my violent reaction, Charles wasn't even a wee bit startled. He only swallowed the bit of raw flesh in his mouth and said, "Sorry, man. I woke up early and got hungry. I thought I'd be done when you got up. My bad." Jesus, H&R Block Christ, Charles. Are you trying to get fucking AIDS and die? Well, first of all, said Charles, a deer can't get AIDS. And second, I've done this plenty of times before and I've never gotten sick from it. Okay, all right, I rubbed my eyes before continuing. Just one question for you. Just one. Is that all right? I think I deserve to ask at least one question at this point. Charles nodded. Okay, cool, thanks, I said. So my question is, man, I know the full moon isn't for another day or two, and I can see that you're already doing, well, that. And I mean no judgment or disrespect or prejudice or whatever the fuck you want to call it, but what I need to know is, when the moon does get full, am I going to end up like Bambi over here? Charles used his arm to wipe the blood off his lips. Probably not. Oh, probably not. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that I'm probably not going to get fucking eaten in the middle of butt-fuck Utah by a goddamn werewolf. And just to check, that is what you are, right? Charles, clearly a werewolf, sighed, rising to meet my gaze, and said, No. I stared at him for a moment. Bullshit, yes you are. He rolled his eyes. Okay, yeah, you got me. Wait, you're actually a werewolf? Yes, said Charles, that is what I am. I didn't choose it, but I gotta live with it. I put my hands in my pockets to hide the shaking. Alrighty then, I said. So what do I need to know? Well, I've been at it for a while now. Pretty much know what I'm doing at this point. I still make mistakes, but for the most part I've got it under control. Mistakes? Mistakes like murdering people? Mistakes like murdering the wrong people, said Charles with his grin, which was stained with deer blood. People I wouldn't murder normally. Oh, gotcha. So what, you can differentiate while you're, wagging my tail? Yeah. Thing is, it's pretty much all by smell, which is why I sometimes get confused. Confused? Yeah. Basically, whenever I'm about to switch over, don't change your deodorant, don't change your shirt, and definitely don't be aggressive towards me. I sighed. Well, all right, good thing I don't have any deodorant. Charles crossed his arms. So, he said, you still down to ride? Yeah, I guess. You just gotta promise you won't eat me. I'll do my best. All right, fuck it, I said back, and shook his hand, my other one still in my pocket. You've got nothing better to do, right? Said Charles. Damn straight. Cigarette time? It's always cigarette time. And so it was cigarette time. Cigarette time, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a time to sit down for a minute, think about the bigger and finer things in life, and sometimes, if need be, go over a few X's and O's. This particular instance of cigarette time fell under the if need be category. We made a rudimentary plan for the day, how we'd get more cigarettes, most importantly of course, then more food, then a place to sleep somewhere closer to the destination. Of the plans made during that cigarette time, the one of the most immediate concern was what we would do should any cops be waiting by the truck when we got to it. So I'm gonna get this straight, said Charles. You saw what I did to this deer over here, and you're afraid of cops? A deer can't shoot you in the face, I snapped, and a deer doesn't have cameras and records and radios and shit. Charles stroked his whiskers. No face, no case. What about my face? What about it? Charles punctuated this sentence by tossing me a ski mask, which he apparently just happened to have hidden in his pants somewhere. At last, I agreed to come along to the truck with the mask on, looking as suspect as humanly possible. The way we went back was the same way we'd come, but the circumstances were different. We were in broad daylight, I was wearing a ski mask, and Charles was completely stained in blood from every angle of visibility. Despite my totally reasonable and not at all paranoid suspicions, there were no cops waiting for us. See? Said Charles. What'd I tell you? Yeah, whatever, I said. It's still better to be safe than incarcerated. You understand I can literally smell cops from a mile away, right? Yes, I understand. I just wanted to be safe. Suit yourself. I just hope you're finding my ball sweat to be rejuvenating. I ripped off the mask and threw it at him. He laughed and I said nothing. I got into the truck and was barely able to contain my rage as I was forced to slam the door about 6 times to get it closed. Charles, who only had to slam his door once, started up the truck, and the extremely loud country music with it, and off we went. The next order of business was for me to walk into a convenience store briskly enough to imply a dead-set purpose for coming in. First, I asked the clerk if there was an open restroom. When he told me yes, I thanked him and rushed through the door I could already see in the first place, making like it was an emergency. Once inside, I immediately unrolled all the toilet paper, dropped the heaping pile into the toilet, and pissed on it. With an infectious sense of urgency, I ran back to the clerk and complained about a big crazy mess in the men's room, leading him back so he could see what I was talking about. While I had the clerk in the restroom, Charles slipped in through the front door and behind the register, managing to steal every carton of Marlboros and spirits in stock and still get out before the clerk and I got back. How exactly he managed this, I couldn't tell you. All I saw was the loot he had waiting with him back in the truck. Just as I was about to bust open one of those packs, Charles nudged me, then pulled yet another piece of the spoils from inside his jacket, a wad of cash, sizable, but not so big that it could be noticed missing from the register right away. To this day, I'm absolutely sure that the clerk shut the register and took the key out before he followed me to the bathroom, so I have no clue how Charles is able to open it so quickly. I never asked him either. Though we did have plenty of money to make the trip, Charles insisted that there was no use in trying to drive for the next 3 days. We'd get a cheap motel room and wait out the full moon, then worry about more money afterwards, when Charles would no longer be, as he put it, incapacitated. Don't ask me where the motel we chose was. I didn't even know until after we checked in that we were somewhere in Idaho. Precise location isn't even the important detail here anyways. The important detail is that quite a bit of traveling had taken place at this point since Charles and I first set up camp in Utah with that bottle of whiskey, and met our good friend, Darcy. We hadn't exactly been hustling to get anywhere. We'd driven 3 or 4 hours during each of the 2 days we'd spent on the move. That isn't much by car, of course, but for a person on foot, especially an elderly person without a sufficient sense of reality or even a pair of shoes, that distance ought to have been a pretty epic mission. taking into account the mountains you'd have to cross to get out of Utah, the trip would realistically take over a week, or maybe just under a week if you hitchhiked. With all that in mind, imagine my shock when I was graced with Mama D's presence at the motel, and wouldn't you know, she still had no shoes. That didn't happen until the next morning, though, so I'll get to that in a bit. On the night when we checked in, Charles told me the beginning. Never mind when I called our first meeting the beginning. The part where I entered the stage is all that really was. The story of WOLFMAN CHARLES goes back a few years further than that, and his bloody origins only set the stage for the rest of the carnage. Warm, comfy, bathed, and eating a couple of $5 pizzas with a 24-pack to wash it down, we sat in plastic chairs with our feet kicked up on the 2 beds in the room. I was armed with a yellow paper tablet from the convenience store across the street and a pen from the motel lobby. He'd never told this story to anybody, or so he claimed, and there was always a chance that he'd meet his death on one of these full moon nights, so Charles figured it best to spill it all out for the record while he could.